This here is AMD's most powerful consumer CPU right now, the 9950X. This bugger is fast. Welcome to Machines More. Today is day one for 9950X and 9900X reviews from AMD. That's exactly what we are going to talk about today. The latest Ryzen 9 parts from AMD's Ryzen 9000 lineup. Lots of nines. But real quick, big thanks to AMD for their support and providing these CPUs for the launch review. However, as with all my reviews here on the channel, they're not sponsored or paid for by the manufacturer, and my testing is completely independent. If you enjoy content like this, please make sure you hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed because it really helps. Big thanks. So last week we looked at the first batch of Ryzen 9000 CPUs, the 9600X and the 9700X. My conclusion there, not overwhelmingly better than the Ryzen 7000 equivalents, especially with the big price drops on those previous gen SKUs, but at the same time, the revised TP and improved efficiency brings about a different set of gains that users may be looking for. So first off, let's take a look at where these particular Zen 5 chips stack up in the current market. And then I'll share some brief changes. We'll take a look at the performance and gaming benchmarks, and then I'll wrap up with some thoughts and recommendations for both of these. At the top of the Ryzen 9000 stack is the Ryzen 9 9950X. This one is the flagship with 16 cores and 32 threads, featuring up to a max boost of up to 5.7 gigahertz. It is spec'd at a TDP of 170 watts, which means that the out-of-box max the chip will draw down is going to be 230 watts PPT. And all of these specs are identical to the 7950X. The retail price on the 9950X I got from AMD was $649. This is $50 cheaper than the 7950X launched at, which has been trending for around $525 US recently. The Ryzen 9900X is AMD's 12-core 24-thread part, and it features a 5.6 GHz max boost, same as the previous Gen 7900X. However, it has a lowered 120 watt TDP versus the 7900X, which had a 170 watt TDP previously. The list price for the 9900X comes in at $499, also $50 lower than what the 7900X launched at. The 7900X is around $360 these days. Despite the issues plaguing Team Blue at the time of this launch, and as mentioned in my 9700X and 9600X review, I can't recommend them at this point, but we do still have to talk about the 14900K, which is an 8 performance core, 16 efficiency core setup. The long duration and short duration power limit for this one is 253 watts, and it's currently going for about $550. And you also have the roughly $380 14700K, which is an 8-core performance cores plus 12 E-cores and 253 power limit. Although in practice, it's not uncommon to see the CPU draw down more than that, depending on the motherboard. Changes going from Zen 4 to Zen 5 for Ryzen 9 is similar to the changes for Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 parts previously covered. The move to a 4nm process from TSMC, the default or guaranteed memory spec is increased to 5600 MHz versus the 5200 MHz previously. Cache sizes have not changed. L2 plus L3 is 76 megabytes on the 9900X and 80 megabytes on the 9950X. And these are dual CCD layouts, so either 6 or 8 active cores per CCD. Each core has 1 megabyte of dedicated cache, and each CCD has 32 megabytes of shared L3 cache, but it's only shared within that particular CCD. What seems to have changed also with the Ryzen 9 parts is that the L1 cache bandwidth is about doubled. Similar latency, while both L2 and L3 have a modest bump up in bandwidth and latency. As we saw with the 9600X when I tested the new Zen 5 core, there was a noticeable IPC increase of almost 15%. And Ryzen 9 uses the same cores, so we would expect to see a similar gain to the IPC improvement. For Ryzen 9000, the new curve shaper feature also gives you the ability to fine-tune a curve offset. For example, if you don't want as aggressive a curve offset at lower power, if you don't want a curve offset at all at those lower frequencies, then you can adjust for that to ensure stability. Taking a look at the power and clock behavior for a multi-core heavy process, such as in Blender 49950X, I saw one CCD boost up to 4950 MHz and the other 4960 MHz. So the clocks between the two are pretty close. Compare this to the 7950X, which had one CCD boost up to 5120 MHz and the other one at 4800 MHz. Now, usually with dual chiplet Ryzen, I've seen differences more akin to that, so the clocks being fairly close is a little bit of a change. With both 9950X and 7950X, the chip drew down about 200 watts PBT. These were all tested on a 360mm AIO with 3 Nocto NFA 12x25s running at full speed, so as to eliminate cooling being a practical limitation there. For the 9900X, the CPU drew basically the max for the 120 watt TDP spec, and at that point the faster CCD was at 5030 MHz while the slower was about 4950 MHz. So definitely the gulf, it's not as big as before between the two CCDs. With the 7900X, there's about a 250 MHz gap between the two. And despite the higher TDP spec on the 7900X in practice, I haven't ever seen it draw much more than this, around 175 watts. Is where I usually see it max out versus a theoretical max of 230 watts. So the TDP change here isn't as dramatic as, say, the 9700X's 65 watt versus the 7700X's 105 watts, where the 7700X would routinely go up to around 140 watts. So that means it's a lot closer to an apples versus apples comparison, although later on I will also up the power to match pretty much exactly, to show you exactly where the 9900X versus 7900X is on a power normalized basis. We touched on this in the R5 and R7 review. The thermal resistance is unchanged. The reported temps, even at similar power levels, is dramatically different though. More than double this difference. Even upping the 9900X to match the 7900X power level, that yields about a 16-degree improvement, similar to the 9950X versus the 7950X, a similar gap, and that's just crazy. Certainly way more of a difference than we saw with the R5 and R7 deltas. The positive for this, you still need adequate heat exchange surface area because you're still drawing the same amount of power through the system, but likely the IHS to cooler contact will be a little bit less finicky. To cool either of these, my recommendation would be at bare minimum at 240mm AIO, and you will be likely at the top end of the fan curve there. So for noise reasons, a 280 or even a 360 would be a lot better, and you can also deploy a good large air cooler like the Nocto D15G2 that I reviewed recently. Core clocks for lightly threaded applications, just taking the max on a single core here during the Cinebench R23 single core render. You can see that the 9950X gets close to the 5.7 GHz spec, whereas, and this can vary, but at least here the 7950X mainly hit 5.5 and peaked at 5.57 very intermittently. The 9900X boosted up to around about 5.55 GHz against the 7900X, which operated similarly to the 7950X, where it would hit around 5.5 GHz. Here we can see that the 9900X is operating at the lowest package power for this type of process versus its peers. The 9950X and 7950X draw pretty much the same amount of power for something like this. The 7900X draws about 9-ish watts more than the 9900X in this scenario. For gaming, just a quick snippet here with Far Cry 6, the 9950X boosts up to 5560 MHz. On CCD1, and we should be seeing the gaming activity delegated to one CCD, but that may not be the case here. There was always one core on CCD2 running at 5500 MHz. The 7950X has a slightly lower gaming boost, but you can see that gaming activity is pretty much strictly delegated to one CCD. The 9950X draws down 101 watts versus 95 on the 7950X. Looking at the 9900X, it runs up to 5.45 GHz on CCD1 versus the faster 5.5 GHz practically on the 7900X. And as with the 9950X, I noticed that at least one and quite often two cores on CCD2 we're seeing prolonged activity, much more often than the 7900X would run this way. And if the 9900X is working this way, it may be introducing a big latency penalty for gaming. The 9900X has the lowest power consumption out of the CPUs here for gaming, roughly 89 watts, and that is compared to the 7900X, which really isn't too much higher. One of the recurring themes for Zen 5 is the increased power efficiency, and we can see this in the amount of energy required to complete a multi-core CPU render. We'll also include the two other new Ryzen 9000 CPUs here, and while the 9950X isn't quite as efficient, it's still very, very good. Finally, compared to the 14th gen K chips, it's really just a massive difference here in efficiency. So pretty exciting stuff. These were tested in a Lian Li A3 mini-itx with a 360mm EAO running 3 Noctua NFA 12x25s at full speed to avoid any cooling limitations. Board is the Gigabyte B650M with a GSA 1.2.00, and GPU used here was the 4080 Super Founders Edition. One quick note, you might be aware of the issues with Intel 13th and 14th gen CPUs now. My testing with the Intel CPUs straddled the old microcode and the stopgap fixed one for the MSI Z690 board that I used, and didn't get the impression that the 14900K off, which is just a 14900K without the iGPU, was living up to its full potential in certain benchmarks. The gaming benchmark seemed absolutely fine, but some of the multi-core heavy renders were a little bit tame. But I will present them as they are. I just realized that it is what it is at this point in time. There are more microcode fixes still being deployed, and it's kind of a messy situation still at this point. So we'll take a look at some synthetics to start. I did get a little kick out of these Cinebench cores. The 9950X is just so incredibly fast here. The 9950X will beat a 14900K, and the 9900 will beat the 14700K. A 9950X is like having two 9700Xs running in parallel, but it's more power hungry than a stock 9700X times 2. So it would be kind of like running two 9700Xs at 98 watts, which I tested previously, and it scores about 20,500, right? That's a little bit less than half. So the 9950X scales up quite well. The increment over their Ryzen 7000 counterparts is about 11 to 13% here in the synthetics, and that's similar to the gains in single core performance as well. The 9950X does have officially the fastest AM5 core right now. The 14900K will still yield the strongest single core performance, and it is still very impressive. So if your applications tend to be more lightly threaded, then the 14900K can still be a very good choice there. These are fairly apples to apples comparisons here because the power levels for the 16 core chips are practically identical, and though the 7900X runs more than the 9900X does at full load, when I upped the 9900X to the same power level, it only netted a tiny increment. Taking a look at the 3DMark TimeSpy CPU test, both Ryzen 9s are behind the 14700K and 14900K. Here all Intel 14th gen CPUs are stronger. You might wonder why. RAM has a big impact here. One thing to be aware is that memory speeds, even with a similar RAM kit, the read-write copy speeds are stronger, even on a relatively lowly 14600K versus the 9950X, and that's why you see them rank higher here. Geekbench is based on actual productivity tasks at varying intensities. Here the increment appears to be 6% for the 9950X and 8% for the 9900X, with higher single core gains at around 11 to 13% versus their 7000 counterparts. The 9900X comes pretty close to beating the 14900K, very impressive. 9950X is definitely the strongest. All Zen 5 Ryzen chips will beat the 14900K for single core processes here. One of AMD's claims was that the 9900X would beat a 14900K by 41% in handbrake, and there's some fine print there. You can see it says up to. I have no idea what format that would be, but here just re-encoding a 4K video to 1080 or X.264, the 9900X was not quicker. It was close, but it was absolutely behind. The 9950X does beat the 14900K, but also looking at X.265, which should take a little bit longer, the 9900X still is behind there, so yeah, I'm not sure that claim is realistic at all. Overall, for a process like this, do expect an 8 to 10% improvement over the Ryzen 7000 equivalents. Blender CPU render scales similarly to what Cinebench would suggest, 12 to 13% improvement in time to completion for Zen 5 versus Zen 4. And this is just one of those areas that Ryzen just performs so well, very, very well against Intel. Fusion Bench for DaVinci Resolve video editing benchmark that will utilize the GPU here. Interestingly, I did not get a better result with the 9900X versus the 7900X. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. Maybe it's the API. 9950X does improve about 2%, and we can see that the Intel CPUs do quite well in this application. So this is one of the benchmarks where the new microcode did seem a little bit wonky for the 14900K. 7-zip compression, 9950X is good overall, and I ran it a few times, but the decompressed score was oddly lower than the 7950X, and you'll notice that the 9900X is behind the 7900X on the decompressed part as well, and perhaps this will work out as new BIOS updates roll in, but it's a little bit odd at this point. Here the 9950X does beat the 14900K, but the 9900X will not pass a 14700K. Overall productivity wise, from my testing, the 9950X is indeed the fastest multi-core consumer CPU now. It's truly impressive. For more lightly threaded applications, it can vary between the 9950X and the 14900K, but it definitely appears that the 9950X has the fastest Ryzen cores now. So based on these benchmarks, it is a little bit mixed. In some applications, you'll see just over 10% for the new Ryzen 9s. Others, don't be surprised if you don't see any difference, or if it's a very small difference, like 2 to 4%. And in some instances, we've seen some regression. So hopefully that's related to the microcode, and as the new AGESA rolls out, we'll retest this, but don't be surprised if there's a small difference there as well. Unlike the 7700X versus the 9700X, where the stock operating package power is vastly different, the 7900X only runs 13 to 16 watts more than the 9900X at full load. Upping the package power of the 9900X interestingly increased the render time, and it wasn't until I upped power 16 watts and set the curve optimizer to -15 on all cores that I managed to see a difference, and even then it's absolutely minuscule. I don't get the impression that there's too much performance left on the table for this one, and what you might do is just leave the same PBT but play with curve optimizer if you want to tinker a bit. It's still really, really paltry though, so this one doesn't seem like it's that fun for overclocking. The 9950X, on the other hand, seemed to respond a bit better. When left unhinged, the CPU hit the throttle of 95 degrees and then finished the render at 217 watts. So I got the impression that that was the high bound to aim for, but I just left some headroom and settled in at 10 watts higher, or 207 watts PBT with a -15 offset on all cores. Cinebench scores went up 5%. Render TTC dropped about 4.5%, and with a -35 offset, I had to. I got their R23 score over 45K, and the render time dropped about 8% versus stock. Now, these are still largely academic gains, but I felt like the 9950X had a little bit more fun to give. You get a Ryzen 9 CPU for workstation tasks, so video, photo editing, some type of intensive workload. And while the core performance carries over to gaming, they absolutely really don't make any sense for a gaming focused system. The 7800X 3D is still the king for that, and I'd say, even consider the 7950X 3D, right, for that type of scenario. These are dual CCD chips, so if a 9900X wants to utilize more than 6 cores on one CCD, there would be a latency penalty from crossing over to the other CCD. Plus, the game would have to be able to utilize the extra cores to begin with. At a high level, it's more or less that the 9900X would equate to a 6-core gaming chip, and the 9950X, you have basically 8 cores. That's the way to think about it. So at best, we shouldn't expect too much better than the 9600X or the 9700X. The 9950X does have the fastest Ryzen cores though, so perhaps it should make a difference. Not really. For Far Cry 6, I saw both the 9700X and 9600X deliver better performance. The 9950X does beat the 7950X, but the 9900X was worse than the 7900X. Marginally better at 1440, but overall the same story versus the 9600X and 9700X. Even a more GPU limited title in Assassin's Creed Valhalla shows the 9900X underperforming all the other Ryzen 9000 CPUs and identical to the 7900X. In Assassin's Creed Mirage, the 9900X actually tested out worse than the 7900X. MSFS 2020's 9900X and 9950X were both worse than two other Ryzen 9000 CPUs. In fact, I saw very few scenarios where the 9950X or 9900X were better than the 9600X or 9700X for Anno 1800 and 1080. The 9950X eked out a very small win over the 9700X, but yeah, overall not great. So I'll let the remainder of the benchmarks play out, and I'll come back and discuss the 9-game average. Overall, for gaming performance, as evidenced from the 9-game geo mean, both CPUs are a little bit of a letdown. The 9700X is actually testing out here to be the best gaming performer for the Ryzen 9000 CPUs so far. And the 9900X and 9950X definitely underperform against the single CCD 6-core 9600X and 8-core 9700X, which instinctively should be at least more or less the same for 9950X versus 9700X and 9900X versus 9600X. For Ryzen 7000, the 7700X at 1080p was a bit stronger than the 7950X, but only by a small amount. Here, the 9900X trails the 9600X by almost 3%, and here's the kicker. As a whole, at 1080, it's worse than the 7900X. The 9950X does end up better than the 7950X. It's ultimately going to depend on the title, of course, right? But if you find this incredible, in AMD's sanity check guide that they provide for reviewers, it's like a reference guide, many titles showed the same phenomenon, where there was little change from 7900X to 9900X, and in some instances they showed regression, and also 9600X or 9700X outperforming. In some sense, it depends on the mix of titles that you ultimately choose, and it's possible that I happened to pick more of the titles that exhibited that phenomenon. But, I had picked the gaming selection well before I got the Ryzen 9000 chips and seen that review guide. So, I try to get a good mix of AAA, FPS, RTS, old and new, just to provide a balanced perspective. So I don't think these are not representative of the true gaming performance here. So it's possible that the CCD behavior isn't quite optimized yet for gaming. As mentioned earlier in this review, for gaming, both chips appear to want to dedicate across the CCDs, and that added latency could explain the performance deficit here. Primary reason you should be choosing either chip, obviously, is not gaming performance, but this may still be a consideration in a mixed system. And here, I'm not seeing that gaming performance is that impressive. As much as Intel has issues now, neither Ryzen 9 SKU outperforms any 14th gen K chip for gaming. Alright, so let's talk some recommendations. For me, the 9900X is the odd one out here. So it's not a bad CPU, don't get me wrong. For productivity, we're seeing similar generational improvements for Zen 5 versus Zen 4 as the 9700X and 9600X when power normalized. There's some inconsistency, but for the most part, CPU heavy applications, you're going to see, around 10%. But if you care about game performance, it is at a very high level, about as good as the 7900X, if not worse in some titles. And that's really not what I was hoping for. So for a roughly $2,500 system budget, The price gap between the two otherwise equivalently configured systems is about 5 to 6%. And I think that might be easier to justify if you also got the same bump in gaming performance. But here's the thing, even if you don't care about gaming, I think the 9900X is in a very weird place. I don't think the thing standing in the way of the 9900X is the 7900X. It's the 7950X at around $20 more than the 9900X. If you're ready for the 9900X, you're pretty much ready to cool a 7950X. And for that extra $20 for the 7950X, you're getting 4 additional cores, which may or may not scale with your workload, but for multi-threaded stuff, you should expect about a 12 to 13% bump up. And the gaming performance of the 7950X is about the same as the 9900X. And to me, if you're looking to go for a $500 part, that 7950X would get a lot more value for you, especially in this type of arena where the workstation performance would be the priority. And if you're really after raw performance, why stop there, right? Because for $150 more or another 5% of your total build cost, you can get the 9950X. So I think there's a very strong argument that this is the fastest productivity CPU out there on the market right now. For how good it is and for being at the top of the stack with the best Ryzen cores, I think the price is actually quite reasonable. Some of you might remember the 5950X, which launched at a whopping $800. The 7950X was $700. So the launch price is not unreasonable in that context. Now you do get tangibly more performance over the 7950X by about the same 10-ish% generational improvement. Gaming is marginal at about a 2% bump. And the thing is, at this level, what the consumer is often after is the absolute fastest system. So while the numbers can make sense, the actual cost-benefit analysis is a little bit less of a consideration at this level. So in short, if you want the fastest of the fastest, you're actually not paying exponentially more for that performance. But part of the problem is that the old generation is not only being sold still along the new lineup, but at much more attractive prices. And that's kind of a discussion for the marketing department. So as mentioned, I don't feel comfortable recommending the Intel chips yet, the 14900K at this point. Depending on the application, my numbers would suggest around a 10% advantage in real-world use for the 9950X in heavily multi-threaded scenarios. The 14900K and even the 14700K are excellent gaming chips as well, about a 5.5% gap over the 9950X there. Keeping in mind that the 14th gen CPUs are just very inefficient in general. So we'll see what happens as they roll out their microcode fixes. My guess is the performance is going to decline somewhat. So go ahead, check out the CPUs. Links are down below. Hope that was helpful and you enjoyed it. So please give a like and make sure you're subscribed. Big thanks for watching today. The Ryzen 9, lots of nines. Ryzen 9 is a 9-core part with 9 threads. Retails for $499. It is, why doesn't it have 99 cores? Why doesn't it run at 9900 megahertz? Why doesn't it run at 9999 megahertz?